Welcome to Industry Focus. I'm your host, Nick Sciple. Joining me today is Motley Fool analyst Ben Ra. Our special guest today is Rui Ma. Rui is an expert in Chinese consumer technology with a background in venture capital and private equity in China. Today, she serves as a co-host of the TechBuzz China podcast. Rui Ma, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So we were talking before the show about your background in China, how you've come to develop an expertise in this space. Can you share that with our listeners and maybe give us a little pitch for the TechBuzz China podcast?
Yeah, sure. As I was saying, I was in China from 2007 to 2015. So for 8 years, full-time working in investing across multiple industries, but primarily in tech, and was lucky to be there while the tech ecosystem really grew in the early 2010s. For TechBuzz China, it's just a recent 2 years ago, started this podcast to fill what I saw was a gap in tech coverage of Chinese companies. And it was primarily to scratch my own itch and then also help my friends understand. But basically what we do is we don't focus exclusively on public equities, but we do talk quite a bit about large companies and so sort of very late stage startups. And we try to give perspective on headline news, what we say headline news that don't always make into English language coverage. So I think we were, for example, some of the first people to talk about like the rise of e-cigarettes in China and a bunch of other topics.
Yeah, so just off the bat, as we dive into Chinese tech, just broadly, from an American perspective, why would you say it's important to understand Chinese technology and the companies coming out of that sector today?
I think that I prepared some stats basically about how China and US are different, but I think everyone probably pretty much knows that China is a very large market. What many people might not realize is how digital it is, especially in consumer internet, right? So enterprise software, it lags quite a bit, but in consumer internet, the penetration of smartphone devices, we have like almost 1 billion devices over there. And then also e-commerce, depending on which stat you look at, it's between 25 and 40% of total retail is e-commerce, which is higher than the US even post-COVID. And it's just very, I think, hard for people who haven't been there to recognize that it's a mobile first, highly digital and very large economy that also in the past 10 years, because of government encouragement and also just because of growth of economy, you also have a lot of talent and a lot of capital. So there's really interesting innovations coming out of China now. When I left at the end of 2015, I still felt like it was still lagging Silicon Valley, but I think now it's pretty obvious in sectors such as e-commerce and digital entertainment. I think these are the two specific sectors in which China actually has some really interesting innovations. Some people say that they're leading. I would just say that they're different and there are lessons that the West could potentially learn.
Yeah, this point of how Chinese technology companies are different and how Americans try to understand them. I think we hear this all the time of Americans will describe Chinese businesses as the blank American business of China. So you've got the Amazon of China, the Google of China, the Tesla of China, that sort of thing. How useful are those descriptions actually in understanding these Chinese businesses?
I think that it's starting to be of more and more of limited use. Actually, I just tweeted I think last week about how one of the companies that we might discuss today, ByteDance, the owner of TikTok, and about how Neil Shen, who's probably the VC with the biggest Midas touch in China. He's the head of Sequoia Capital China. And in an interview, he said that he did not invest in ByteDance because ByteDance couldn't position itself as blank of China because it was not following a Silicon Valley precedent. And then he said that he learned his lesson after he saw the company succeed and realized that, hey, actually, I shouldn't be sticking to the old thinking of, only investing and what we call clones or copycats. So I think that that is starting to be more and more the case. And then of course, Pinduoduo, I think is one of the companies that we'll be discussing today. And similarly, it's very difficult to pin down an American analog, or even a combination of analogs is hard.
So Ray, for the American investor, because we look at China a lot, But we've had some experiences with companies like Luckin Coffee, which I believed in at one time. I heard that a lot of Chinese people on the street considered it like a stock for like dumb Americans. And this is something that I heard recently. So how important is it to like actually be on the street and know what's going on in China?
Yeah. Yeah, we did a whole episode on Luckin, and it was interesting to see its coverage in the US media. And then, of course, in case there are anyone in the audience who don't know about this stock, it was basically a really, really big fraud. So made up substantially all of its revenues. I'm not sure that if you were just visiting China, you would have necessarily, or even lived there or talked to people there regularly, would have necessarily known it was a fraud, because I think that in itself was still a surprise to many Chinese people. I think if you had a better understanding of the market, you probably might have just been more aware, right? And might have been more like, I think if you read Chinese coverage of the company, a lot of people were just more skeptical of the products they were rolling out, right? Because it would just been more obvious to you if you were culturally fluent that like actually milk tea is a much bigger market, but it has a lot of competitors. So when they started launching these like vending machines and new tea products, you could much more easily compare it to the competition and be like, oh, that's not actually competitive, and that's just PR, or basically have more context. So I would not say that in the case of that company, everyone in China knew it was a fraud or anything. But I do think there definitely was a lot of discussion. Like people were like, why do Americans love this company so much? It must be because they like coffee. So that there was a little bit of that. Like there was confusion, I think, in China why this was such a high flying stock. But let's not like also paper over the fact that people in China didn't know it was a fraud either.
So I think like one of the reasons is because we think of China as this growing economy, and obviously, economy in that situation, you kind of want to get at businesses that are in consumer goods, things that people actually buy. And I think in China, the market now, I mean, there's this IPO of the semiconductor company, for example, SMIC. It's kind of a different focus than here. Like I think the government plays a bigger role. So the companies that are sort of seen as being endorsed by the government seem to have more popularity, at least in the market. How important is that link with the government? How do you think about that? Because it is a closer relationship. There are we consider the Communist Party here as like the worst thing in the world. I know it's much more complex than that, but all of these companies do have links with the Communist Party in terms of their employees being members and all that. How do you think about that interplay between government and business?
Yeah, so I think for the most part, so I worked in real estate investing my first 2 years in China, and then it's very obvious that having good government relations is crucial to your business. In fact, that might be the single most important factor over everything else. I think, and then I also did some media investing, and that is also a very big factor. And media is a protected industry, so again, it's very different. But like when it comes to digital companies and technology and internet companies, what I found, and I confirmed with many other people, just in case it was just not my own private experience, which is that in general the government actually is not very involved until the company is much bigger, in which case it's a lot of it is actually just people trying to take credit, right? It's like every district and city's like, hey, I was the one who incubated Alibaba, give me some credit for bringing all these jobs and, upgrading my economy to a service economy, knowledge worker economy here in my district. I think that when it comes to companies that have content on it, for sure, there are local regulations where, it's basically self-censorship and moderation is highly important. We've seen companies, even publicly listed companies, have their apps taken off of app stores in China because they violated something or another, right? And a lot of times it's not clear what the violation was. So I think in that sense, for internet companies, that is typically what I see as the sort of relationship with the government, that the government will come in and regulate you. And there's always the fear that you may have triggered something and you get taken off of app stores, which is horrible. It is quite different from the case that you're talking about, which is SMIC. That is very different, I think. So the semiconductor industry is one where China like greatly lags behind, you know, the US and Japan and whatever. So that is also a very CapEx intensive industry. And the government has announced this like $70 billion, you know, what they call big fund into the industry. And everyone in China can see sort of the trade tensions that's hinging upon protecting you know, on the US side of protecting the semiconductor IP. So I think in that case, it's actually quite different. I would say in general, in internet, what you really have to think about is like changing rules, right? Like gaming regulations and, you know, approvals not being approved for companies like Tencent that depend on government approvals before they can monetize. Of course, when it comes to content companies, the risk of overstepping some kind of boundary and then effectively getting temporarily banned is often the case.
Yeah, so I want to get into more of the content issues later on in the show. I know we're going to spend some time talking about TikTok, but you mentioned the lag of Chinese technologies in the semiconductor space and comparing and contrasting that with the internet. One of the questions I wanted to ask you about is a common narrative you'll hear in the U.S. around Chinese technology is that Chinese companies don't innovate, they're fast followers, IP theft, that sort of thing. To what extent is that narrative valid? Is it more true in some sectors than others? Can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, I think like when I was working there and I represented, for example, you know, media companies, there was always like some kind of issue going on of IP infringement, et cetera. I think overall it's gotten better. A lot of it because domestic businesses are now defending their IP, right? But how much better? Well, I was reading this dispute between I guess people on Twitter talking about IP in defense in China versus the US. And I went and looked up the stats, and it's true that like in general, right, even the highest IP infringement in China like did not get the kind of payouts that you see here in the US. But I don't know if that's necessarily indictment of the Chinese system, and maybe it's just because we're really litigious here. But what I can say is I think generally IP rights are rising. It's probably not still as good as the US, but I think it's greatly improved from the impression that many people have, which is like there is no IP protection, and I don't think that's true anymore. That being said, I think in general, a lot of, if you're talking about sort of copying product design, for example, if you see just the amount of furor that people, the amount of talk, right, that came about when, you know, Facebook, Instagram copied Snapchat, for example, right? It's like they'll never live that down, right? But in China, that's just not a big thing. People are just like, oh, you know, innovation, that's an interesting product feature. I'm going to put it in my product. In fact, what you'll see is that, you know, maybe people will be putting into their products even when they shouldn't be. So you'll see these bloated products with copying the best of many other things. And I think culturally, it's just that's not considered a big problem. I wouldn't say it's necessarily applauded, but it's not considered like thievery like it is here. And also, I think what is something that to think about is in China, I would say, yes, you see product innovations on, like I said, e-commerce and digital entertainment, but also overall, I think there should be a distinction between fundamentally novel technologies and then innovations in the application of the technology. So what I'm trying to say is that basically like the US still leads, it seems, for the most part, especially in AI and all these other and semiconductors, et cetera, in fundamental research. But I think China has a lot of strengths also in applying some of the technologies once it's released into the wild, right? So because there's also value in that, right? You could be the first person to discover something, but you could be also the first company to apply it at scale. And those take different competencies and of course have different values, I guess, to the investor. An example I like to give is like when, this is an old example, but when I was doing technical diligence for proposed investment in peer-to-peer sharing, video sharing in China, this is over 10 years ago. You know, the consultants we picked were based in the US and were Westerners, and they basically said, well, this technology is obviously not like very novel, but the fact that the company you're looking at could support the number of concurrent users it could, just because China is a huge market, really shows that this company does have some core technology, right? They didn't develop peer-to-peer file sharing, but they were really good at applying it. And I think that might be more of the quote unquote innovations that you see from China, the scaling up.
Right. When you talk about these kind of applications innovations, that brings me to one of those companies you mentioned earlier, Pinduoduo, which I want to talk about a little bit here. I mean, this is a company founded in September 2015. 5 years later, it's one of the 3 biggest e-commerce companies in China, and it is one of these companies that defines the blank of China definition. So for folks who aren't familiar with this business, how would you describe Pinduoduo to an American?
Yeah, well, as you noted in your notes, the prospectus describes it as Costco meets Disneyland, which I always thought was very weird. But like, I think what they mean is Pinduoduo is basically this app where you go in and I would say the primary value proposition is that things on it are cheap. That has several implications. It's cheap because basically a lot of the products are unbranded. So which I don't think it's the same with Costco, because I shop there and I shop like branded goods, but like the idea is that you go in, you are pushed a lot of these deals, and these deals obviously are different each time you log in, and they try to personalize it and whatnot, but effectively you don't go in typically primarily trying to search for something. You go in basically and you interact with the feed. That's the primary selling point, where you're just like shown all of these really, really cheap products. So I think in that sense, that's what the founder means by it's like Costco, because you go in, you know, Costco doesn't even mark its aisles. So you go in and you like wander the store and like buy whatever deals appeal to you at the time. Another innovation it has is that it tried to use basically your social graph, your friends network, to do group buying purchases. So it used to be that you needed to get like tens of people to get a special price on a deal, right? So like the 3 of us, for example, could get a lower price if we bought together. But basically that was a gimmick for it to really just acquire customers very quickly. And it was able to do that because it was invested in by Tencent, and who still owns about 17%, I think, of the company. And Tencent owns, as the audience probably knows, WeChat, a billion MAU super app in China. And so Pinduoduo was able to do that. And that's why some people call it social commerce, although I really think the social element of it is quite limited by this point, because they're at 600 million active buyers now. So they're sort of limited, I think, you know, games they could play by like, oh, invite your friends to buy this with you together. And then the final thing I think that Pinduoduo is really different about Pinduoduo that people might not realize is that it actually works very closely with suppliers, right? So like I said, a lot of the goods are unbranded, and Pinduoduo actually started off by this merger of a fruit selling platform and then a gaming company. So the idea is that it takes consumer insights from the buying data and inform suppliers on what to make. So they call that model C2M, consumer to manufacturer. And you see a lot more companies in China doing this. And basically the idea is that, you know, you take the consumer demand, you aggregate it, and then you're able to like pick out the most salient points and then inform the supplier, in fact, what to make. So in that way, you sort of have this virtuous cycle where the supplier doesn't have to wonder about what to make and how much to make. They already know. So it's much less risky for them. And hopefully that means they can give you better pricing. And then this model just juices itself even further.
For me, it kind of exemplifies, yeah, like almost like the gamification of e-commerce, where there's like this merging between entertainment and e-commerce, or social media and e-commerce. You see the live streaming going on Taobao. And also, I think on Pinduoduo, they have a live stream function now,
yep,
where people could get on and show their product and you could buy it there immediately. I see that as being much, I mean, Facebook is trying to do it with Facebook Shops. So there's a little bit of that going on here in the US, and I think that's going to proceed here. I feel that in China, it's much more advanced. Can you describe what that world looks like in China, that sort of merging between entertainment, live streaming, social media, and the e-commerce? How does that work in China?
Yeah, so I think, well, first of all, just the live streaming e-commerce, right? So a lot of people, I think Amazon also tried to do this. I watched a couple of their live streams and I found it to be very, very different from the experience in the Chinese apps, which is that, you know, a lot of the e-commerce live streamers, you have sort of two different types. One is actually selling their own goods, right? So these are literally farmers where they're just like live streaming on their phone next to their crops. Like I watched one where there was this beekeeper and she was just like with her bees, you know, talking about her honey. And then you have other ones who are sort of more polished. They are almost like entertainment stars where they're like really funny. They're really good at talking up the product and getting the energy up. And then these people are selling other people's products primarily. So they have deals with a lot of like actually the very big brands to sell things. And the biggest live streamers in China are actually of the second category, right? Like one lady, her name is Via, she's the top live streamer on Taobao. And just to give you some context of how big she is, the GMV, not her revenues, because she takes a cut of it, but the total amount of goods she sold in 2018 was equivalent to one of the top malls in Beijing. Right. So it's like, it's like take like a well-known mall, you know, and then that person sold that much in 1 year. And I think that the difference is like, yeah, it's live streaming. You get into a room where there could be thousands of other people. You could gift and get attention from the live streamer, give them, you know, like stuff that you buy that from virtual currency. But the primary thing is that you can ask them questions and you can interact with them, and you get the sense that number one, you're more connected with them. So maybe you start trusting them more. Like Via, she has a lot of fans who just really trust her recommendations, right? And that she's giving them the best price. But also, yeah, it is more entertainment in the sense that like a lot of these live streamers have really interesting personalities. And at least for me, you know, watching like a farmer sell their goods in their like house or in their field, right? Versus like looking at a shelf of fruit in the supermarket is a very different experience. So I think in that sense, it's still very different, yeah, from I think what the West is doing in terms of live streaming e-commerce. But that is definitely one of the areas in which I would say China is ahead. I mean, just looking at the amount of users who use it daily and the amount of GMV going through these platforms, that is probably one of the fastest growing e-commerce segments in China.
You mentioned earlier the relationship between Tencent and Pinduoduo. They've built basically their entire business on top of WeChat. I mean, this is a nearly $100 billion business built inside another multi-$100 billion business. Can you talk about these dynamics of building a business inside WeChat's mini apps, how it works, and how Pinduoduo specifically has exploited that to build their business?
Yeah, so I think for WeChat, for those of you who don't understand it, it's primarily a messaging app. While it has a social feed, a lot of it is based on the fact that it's really it should be between trusted people, right? So it's primarily between your close social network. And what Pinduoduo did was, number one, Tencent and Alibaba are nemesis in China, and they actively block each other's services from being accessible inside their own apps, right? So like actually if I had to send a Taobao link, for example, to someone inside of WeChat, you have to give like this special code. It's kind of weird to explain, but basically it's like as if, you know, you can't send, I don't know, Twitter links through your Facebook Messenger or something like that, right? So you do sort of have to pick a side. Very few companies have been able to get away with not picking a side, but what Pinduoduo did was just exploit that, right? So it said in the beginning, and it still does it now, but in the beginning much more so, where they had a couple games, you know, like I said, group buying. So of course, maybe the default option is to go to your family and friends and be like, hey, I could buy this fruit for 16 whatever RMB a pound, but if we buy it together, then it's 8 RMB. A lot of the deals actually give you significant cost savings if you just brought in other people. And then there were other games like you could bring in your friends to cut the price for you. So it was literally like this movement of like slashing the price. So each friend you invited, you know, to do you a favor of like basically clicking on this link, slash the price for you. And then, you know, your hope is that it goes down to 0. Of course, it never does. And then there were these even like lottery games, right? Where everyone could put in a small money. It's almost a little bit like gambling, a small amount of money. And let's say the prize would be big, it'd be like an iPhone or something. But then if we all put in money, we all have like a chance to win. So they did a lot of these gamifications where it was really easy because of the very social nature of WeChat, especially among close connections, that people would like be like, yeah, it's cool, sure, Ray, like, you know, you're my cousin or whatever, I will click on this link and just help you out. But what they did was then they basically installed the mini app by doing that action onto their WeChat. And I think, as you noted in the notes, basically Pinduoduo to this day has a lot of active users on WeChat, even though they have also their own standalone app. But I think the active number of users, it might still be higher in their WeChat mini program than in their standalone app.
Well, I think that's been really impressive to me looking at their data as well, is not just, I mean, you see the social aspect about how customers can stumble across your brand, become familiar with it, you know, see an opportunity to save some money, but their retention rate, I mean, is that, I mean, just the social aspect of the platform, being able to keep folks around once they get them in, how do you explain why their retention rate is so high? Because it's even better than JD and Alibaba's retention.
Okay, this just be my personal opinion, talking to lots of friends who use Pinduoduo. Obviously, I don't use it here in the US. I have Costco. But I think a lot of it is just because the goods they recommend are sort of everyday items, right? So I think the one case study they put, you know, out very early on, and I think everyone in China knows about, is like tissue paper, right? They just have these like very cheap consumable items where, you know, toothpaste, like whatever it is, that's actually just is high frequency buying, period. And number two is like, once you start getting used to the program and you are, you know, you're okay with like the feed and you know what you're looking for, or you are cool with being recommended items on the platform and you are okay with its quality, which by the way is not the greatest because of the cost generally. So if you know, if you can accept that level of quality and the fact that it takes a little longer than many of the other e-commerce platforms, or you're willing to put up with it because you want the cheaper price, then I think, yeah, it makes sense. It's not really as much the social aspect, because yeah, they have games in there and stuff, but I don't think that is really what's driving the sales. Another important point I think we didn't get to talk to earlier, which is that in China you have the urban rich, you know, who might lead very like lives that most of us might recognize here. They drink Starbucks and do intermittent fasting and whatnot. But then you have 1 billion people who live in much poorer places where the infrastructure is very different. That's always, I said, one of the reasons why e-commerce is so advanced in China, because if you look at offline retail for most of, you know, non-super urban China, it's very crappy. So your experience of going into your store down the street is horrible. So you'd much rather of course, buy things online. And that is also, in large part, Pinduoduo's initial customers. They were actually known as sort of like Taobao, or they called it e-commerce for people outside the fifth ring. And outside the fifth ring in China is kind of like this concept of, people who are not as rich, not urban.
Other side of the railroad tracks.
Yeah, yes. Something to that effect.
There's been some management, I don't want to say shakeups, but going on with Pinduoduo, where Colin Huang, who's the founder CEO, is going to leave. I think he's already no longer the CEO, right? So in conjunction with what's going on with like JD.com, I kind of see Richard Liu kind of taking a back seat.
Yeah.
What's your take on like the management changes that are taking place in both companies? Is there something that we should be watching out for? Is this something that, is it possibly something that's across the board in China, or just unique to those two companies?
Yeah, well, I mean, Jack Ma also did the same, although I guess his retirement was technically like 10 years in the making. I think that, I unfortunately don't have personal insight into this, but I can tell you some of the analyses I read. Of course, some people are a little bit skeptical or suspicious of the moves. And then there are other people who say, especially in the case of Colin, his good mentor, Duan Yongping, who is a very successful entrepreneur, Warren Buffett fan, actually brought Colin to his Warren Buffett charity lunch many years ago, is a guy who's dedicated his life to philanthropy and, is mostly behind the scenes and an investor currently. Colin is on the younger side for doing that, but there are some people who think he's just merely following in his mentor's footsteps. I don't know. It seems a little bit early given how young his company is, just sort of 5 years old. But at the same time, that I guess he's had health issues in the past, and maybe there are good reasons for him to do this. So that's the level of insight I have, unfortunately.
Yeah. In any event, Pinduoduo, fantastic business to watch. I mean, its growth has been incredibly impressive, and we'll just have to see where the company goes from here under, with the new management or him moving up to the chairman role, et cetera. Another company I wanted to talk about while we had you here is TikTok and ByteDance. I think that's one clear example when you look at TikTok. That's an app that went from a standing start at 0 in 2016 to kind of like Pinduoduo today. I'd say it's one of the 5 most important social media apps in the world. And from my perspective, TikTok has been the first Chinese app that's really succeeded and gone viral in the West. Even WeChat is used mostly by Chinese expats abroad. Why has TikTok been so successful where other Chinese apps have struggled?
Okay, yeah, a couple of things. So I've spent a lot of time researching ByteDance because I'm actually writing an ebook on the company. But basically, I would say a couple of things, right? So the company itself was very intent on going global from the very beginning. So someone leaked their 2013, they were founded in 2012. Someone leaked their 2013 board deck, and it basically was like, we're going international. So from the very beginning, the entrepreneur, the founder, Zhang Yiming, has been very clear that like, hey, if we limit ourselves to China, even though China is a huge market, it's still, after all, only 1/5 of the world's population. We can never be a company like Google, Facebook, et cetera, right? So the idea that a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs of the past decade have is that when mobile internet came about, so while the PC internet era, the US was much further ahead, when it comes to mobile internet, everyone's sort of at the same starting point. So if you want to, if you want to build a global company, you can, and that's their mantra, right? Global from day one. The reason why they're successful is, of course, they have this algorithm-driven engine that's not social graph based. So they don't, TikTok, for those of you who don't use it, is basically just skips over your social graph altogether. You don't need to have friends on the platform. You don't even need to know who you want to follow because the algorithm decides everything for you, right? Like the simple way to explain it is all the other content platforms prior to this, you go in and you tell the platform what you want to look for. Whereas TikTok brings the content to you. So you go in, and it's like almost a passive experience. My friend Eugene Wei called it the sorting hat from Harry Potter, right? It kind of knows what you want and just feeds it to you. And I think that that's one reason why they were able to grow. But of course, like the reason why they were the first Chinese company to do so is, number one, this algorithm driven engine is not as dependent on sort of cultural understanding of the population that you're trying to serve, right? And they were able to also capitalize on the huge surge in video worldwide. But at the same time, I do have to give the give the company a ton of credit for really using local operations, right? That's something they're still in the process of trying to do more and more of. But if you look at their company structure and staff versus a lot of the other Chinese companies, culturally, they're much more decentralized. They really empower local employees, and the amount of like truly international talent that they've hired is, I think, substantially larger than many other Chinese tech companies. So you can see that they're really applying sort of a global management philosophy, as well as they were lucky with this product that can go global and has less friction, relatively speaking, to go global.
Do you think they have any potential with e-commerce? I know they've been trying for a while to integrate that into their platform. Do you think they'll do a good job there, or is it purely going to be short videos?
Yeah, so the thing about, you're talking about ByteDance, right? So ByteDance is a lot bigger than just TikTok, and TikTok, in fact, its Chinese version, Douyin, is much more advanced than TikTok, and live streaming e-commerce being one of the main things that you could do on there that's different. So you can live stream already on TikTok, but live streaming e-commerce but being able to buy things directly is still a different experience. I think that for ByteDance, it's pretty obvious they're making this into their next big platform. So in the beginning of 2019, they not restructured necessarily, but really put in a lot of resources and engineering talent into the live streaming platform. And that's because if you look at China, there is another short video platform called Kuaishou that is also quite big. So $25 billion-ish valuation. And unlike ByteDance, which gets substantially all of its revenues through advertising, Kuaishou actually does it through live streaming e-commerce and live streaming transactions, right? So that is something that you can see that ByteDance is going after as well. I think so far you can see we work with a Big One Lab, which is a analytics alternative data platform in China, and you can see like e-commerce live streaming is just really blowing up everywhere, and Douyin is actually doing quite well. So I think that there's no doubt in my mind that that's one of the huge things there, huge verticals are going after, and features and functionalities. But also, I am personally, I guess, pretty bullish on their prospects there.
So I don't think we could get by without talking about the measures that the U.S. government's taking against TikTok, and the worries that we have here that the Chinese government can get access to this data. What do you think about that, and how do Chinese people on the street think about that, you think?
Yeah, so I think that like the national security concerns that have been raised are definitely legitimate, in the sense that if an adversarial government has access to your citizens' data, that seems to be very problematic. At the same time, I do think there are various experts who have pointed out that that's not, even if that's happening, we need a sort of broader legislation overall on how our data is treated, because there are all these advertising companies, for example, that are sort of freely selling our data, that basically not just TikTok or whatever other many people are having access to. I think that for on the ground Chinese reaction. So I wrote about this a little bit. I think you sort of can use two words. One is resignation and one is indignation. And I think they exist in equal measure. So for, like most most Chinese people, like except for the trolls on Weibo, which is China's Twitter, right? So like most reasonable Chinese people are like, yeah, like, our government also limits the access of foreign companies or even domestic ones, but like heavily, moderates, let's call it censors, polices, whatever, the content on our internet and our access. So it's sort of inevitable or understandable, let's call it understandable, that a foreign government would do the same. At the same time, they think that it is kind of sad, right, that this is happening, and that, in the case of TikTok, that like maybe, in the case of TikTok, I think people are more understanding because of the, Trump rally story and whatever. But in the case of, I think, WeChat, a lot more people are just like, I don't understand why that's happening, because it's so, not widely used, as Nick said, and it's also not a open content platform. In fact, it's quite closed. So there is, but there's a surprising amount of resignation, and I think understanding, actually, than I had previously imagined. I thought people would be just like very up in arms, but there is a lot more people I talked to who are like, well, yeah, that might just be how it is, with many countries going forward. Yeah. And
what about Huawei, which might be the more important with Huawei?
Yep. More important with Huawei. I think Huawei is a little bit different. And I think because of the nature of the business that it's in, like telecom equipment, and the fact that it's like people have, well, I think Huawei has, relatively speaking, been less controversial inside of China in many ways. It's been around a lot longer. ByteDance, by the way, is a very controversial company inside of China. A lot of the people who complain about like, oh, all our kids wasting their hours watching dancing and lip syncing videos. Hey, you hear the same exact complaints from parents and other people in China about, Douyin. So I would say in that respect, it's actually not necessarily like the most loved company. Huawei tends to be less controversial because, what are you complaining about? Like, it's phones, right? Or, no, not many people have experience with telecom equipment, for example. And so I think for Huawei, there is a lot more probably people who feel that the company was wronged. Yeah. Whereas ByteDance has far less support, I think, inside of China.
So we're speculating here about the possibility of TikTok being acquired by, I don't know, Microsoft or by Twitter. Mm-hmm. I think some people say that I would probably go with the side that it's going to be a lot harder. I think they're going to drag it out along a lot longer than people might think. What's your feeling about that? What do you think is going to happen there in terms of the possible acquisition, a lawsuit?
Yeah, I mean, I'm following this like anyone else. I think I have been talking to employees like inside the company and ex-employees, et cetera, about how they feel. So I don't have any inside information. All I know is that like ByteDance, I think itself has put out this air, I guess, or a PR inside of China that this is not going to affect its business in the long run because revenue contribution wise, international still very, very, very limited. Last year it was like, de minimis out of its something like $18 billion revenue pool. Like the US contributed really not very much, nothing at all. And even this year, pre-ban, it was expected to only contribute $500 million, which I think would be very optimistic at this point. I think that for the lawsuits that it's been threatening, like it has to make some kind of move to protect its domestic stance, because in China, again, there's so much criticism of the fact that and this is maybe misunderstanding of the US system, but they're like, hey, Huawei put out all these sort of hard-edged statements and defended itself really well. Like, what are you doing, TikTok, right? So, and I don't know if you saw, but TikTok actually finally came up with a website, tiktokus.info, where it at least so far, seems to have taken one of the harder stances against media coverage and whatnot. U.S. government maybe put out basically an information site on, oh, we're the good guys, we're being wronged here. So at least on that front, they have to put up somewhat of a fight. It's setting a precedent, right, for not just themselves and maybe their future businesses, but also all other Chinese internet companies. So I think, yeah, that's probably going to happen more. As for how long everything will take, yeah, I have no idea. I've been asking a lot of lawyer friends, but I don't think anyone really knows, because this is such a special and unique case. And, you know, we have an administration that put out these executive orders that basically has everyone flummoxed, right? Legal experts, company executives, no one really understands. In fact, I was just on a podcast with a UK media, and one of the other guests was the guy who wrote Jack Ma, Alibaba, and he's the house Jack Ma built, and he's like a China internet expert. And he basically said something I thought was really true, which is that the executive orders read a lot like Chinese draft law, extremely vague. And you just don't know what it means until more clarity comes out. So,
yeah. So I want to kind of conclude at a couple questions going away. The first, as you've talked about over the past several years, tensions between the U.S. and China, you know, bubbling over, continuing to become more and more tense. If we assume current trends and policies remain in place or are enforced, and I know it's really hard to predict the future, but if we make that assumption, how do you think the landscape for tech companies in China looks different 5 years from now than it does today?
Yeah, I just think that it's going to be, yeah, like you said, it's going to be very, very hard to predict. But I know that in the near term, at least as of right now, right, it seems that Chinese companies have, and investors, right, because they are, after all, you know, the capital side matters, are far less interested in going into at least the Western market, the US market, than they were a few years back. And a lot more attention is being focused on internal domestic market, you know, and like we said, Pinduoduo, for example, is one of those examples where you could build a $100 billion business just focused on rural consumers in China, right? So I think that is going to take up a lot more attention in the next few years because of the political tensions, but also because of the fact that there are viable opportunities there. That being said, I think also there's going to be a lot more interest in the industries that the U.S. has come out with sanctions against, right? So semiconductors, I think, you know, pretty much everyone knew for the longest time that like China's really weak in semiconductors, but there was just no incentive to go there, right? When you have these other lower, what do you call it, like lower lying fruit that you can go after, right? Why go after something like so capex intensive and risky when you can go and, you know, build an app? But now I think there's going to be a lot more talent being interested in this business because they see a true opportunity, right? This is a captive market where if you don't do it, you know, like, you know, other people now can't, right? So now you can go after it as a domestic player. I also think the political tensions will probably result in some sorts of new alliances. I'm actually pretty new to semiconductors, really didn't look much at it before, but just researching it for, you know, understanding more about China tech in general, I found that it's not just the US who's in this market, right? There's also Japan, Korea especially has incentive to cooperate with China because of its northern neighbor that it wants China to help keep in check, right? So you might see different alliances like exist, whereas before it was uneconomical for a lot of these businesses to do these things. But now that the some markets are decoupling, then you're going to see other international players jump in and take advantage of the opportunity as well.
Okay, and then last question. You pay a lot of attention to China and developing businesses in that country. What's one Chinese company you're excited about that a lot of Americans wouldn't be familiar with?
Yeah, so I think going back to just like tying it with what we said earlier about, like, for example, Pinduoduo, ByteDance, et cetera. These are innovations in entertainment and e-commerce. And especially for Pinduoduo, because of its closeness with the supply chain. A lot of its business model is really benefiting from that. I think another company that people don't realize is Chinese is this company called Shein, and actually it's very low profile inside of China. It's only started to get coverage recently because everyone thinks they're preparing for an IPO. But if you look at app stores, you'll see that they're like top shopping app in many, many different regions. And I think what's interesting about them is that this is a company that had the founding team started off being in search engine optimization. So they're really good at using data to drive decision making. And what they've done is they've been able to collaborate with the supply chain. They're located in southern China, the manufacturing supply chain for fashion in China, and they've been able to reduce turnaround time from design to shipping product to 5 days, right? So, and they've I don't know if they've perfected, but they're in the process of really optimizing using data-driven marketing, right? Like literally putting photos out there of goods that don't yet exist, and then making it, and then getting feedback, and then deciding whether or not to go all in on more advertising for that product. So I think that's just really interesting in terms of, you can see big data and e-commerce. This is the dream, right? For every fashion manufacturer out there, to have no waste, to know exactly what you should be selling to whom, and then sort of making it. So yeah, I think that's an interesting company.
So Shein, that's Shein?
Yeah, yeah.
Awesome. So yeah, write that one down, folks. Ray, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. If folks want to check out the TechBuzz China podcast, pay attention to your work, where can they go do that?
Oh, very easy. We're on all the platforms. It's just TechBuzz China, 3 words. And you can also go to our website, techbuzzchina.com. So I have a newsletter, and we're putting out a lot of sort of primary information on ByteDance, if that's a company that you're interested in recently. Yeah.
Thank you, Ray.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Awesome. As always, people on the program may own companies discussed on the show, and the Motley Fool may have formal recommendations for or against the stocks discussed. So don't buy or sell anything based solely on what you hear. Thanks to Tim Sparks for mixing the show. For Rui Ma and Ben Ra, I'm Nick Sciple. Thanks for listening, and Fool on.